morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Walker. So our topic today is stormwater detention. It isn't just for flood control anymore. Obviously, it is for flood control, but we want to make it into a workforce and find ways to have it be multi-objective. My company, Water, is a water resources firm. We specialize in hydrology, hydraulics, low-impact development, water quality, and also water supply. We provide environmental services as well as landscape architecture. And we have offices in Houston and Austin, but we work throughout the state. Most of our projects are in California and Texas, although we also have quite a bit of experience in other places like Alaska and have worked across the US. If anybody has follow-up questions, I would be more than happy to continue the conversation with you. I'll leave my cards for you as well, but you're welcome to email me or touch base if additional information is helpful. I'd like to acknowledge our partners on the two primary projects I'm going to cover today. The first one is the City of Houston Stormwater Multi-Use Detention Criteria Project. And City of Houston, Kevin Hammond was the project manager, Half Associates, the prime, and we had quite a few other stakeholders, the maintenance group, stormwater group, Harris County Flood Control District, Harris County, and also the Parks Department. The second project that I'm going to focus on is City of Austin Watershed Protection Volumetric Design Procedure. So there were quite a number of folks from the City of Austin involved. The prime on that project was Freeze Nichols, and the stakeholders were primarily internal, at least as far as water was involved. So topics today, I'll sprinkle a few other projects in just to illustrate some of the points related to the various criteria, but we're really going to focus on City of Houston, stormwater environmental performance standards. Basically, it's multi-use detention criteria. It's been adopted by the city now. It's not available online yet, but if you'd like to get a copy, just leave me your card at the end and I'll make sure we get you a copy of it. City of Austin Volumetric Design Procedure, same thing if you're interested in more information. Also leave me your card and we'll get you a copy of it. Okay, so the City of Houston Multi-Use Detention Basin Criteria. I'd also like to acknowledge Jennifer Lundberg, Water's project manager and senior planner on the project. If anybody has more detailed questions, she'll be able to address those, and I may pull her in if we have some discussion at the end. So basically, we took guidance and we looked at criteria to turn City of Houston detention basins into multi-use facilities, whether that be water quality, recreation, aesthetics, or environmental concerns. And it's not, we'll get into, it's not just a matter of changing up the design. There are a lot of other considerations like who's going to maintain the basin, you know, what type of interlocal agreement is required and so forth. But the primary purpose of detention is still flood control, so we really need to make sure that first and foremost is met. So basically there was quite a bit of stakeholder coordination on this to make sure that the maintenance folks got to weigh in, that other groups within the city got to weigh in, and then also, really importantly, in some cases the city may want to turn over their basins to the flood control district for maintenance, so getting their participation, and then also Harris County. The Parks Department too, because some facilities could be on parks land. We'll look at a couple of projects where that's happened. So while this is primarily geared towards City of Houston CIP projects, the criteria really can be used for other projects. You know, it could be private development projects or other projects within the city. Okay, so there's a range of criteria and guidance, and there's things that you don't even really think about, like if it's used for recreation, you know, what about lighting? Who's going to maintain the lighting? The flood control district, you know, they might accept it for maintenance in terms of mowing, but they're not going to maintain necessarily an irrigation system if it's required, or a lighting system. They may not want to maintain restroom facilities. Which ideally are not going to be, you know, smack dab in the middle of the basin, but they may be within like an extended storage area. So this was originally, I think it was previously started by AECom and then handed over to the Half Water Earth team, and Water Earth picked it up and finished out the criteria. So what we need to look at is who, in the end, who's going to be responsible for maintenance. And again, it might be that the city's going to do it. It may be the city's going to turn it over to the flood control district. In some cases, the flood control district is fine if an agreement is in place with maybe Parks Department that they'll maintain ancillary features, or there may be another community organization that will step up and accept maintenance of non-flood control facilities. So obviously on the flood control side, we have things like mowing and trash removal and ideally sediment removal. You know, even on a non-multi-use basin, that's a really important part of maintenance that often doesn't get done or accounted for. You know, so kind of general rule of thumb is maybe, you know, in 10 or 20 years, you're gonna have to remove sediment, but if you're using it for recreation, you may need sediment removed quicker unless you build in some pre-treatment BMPs to consolidate the sediment location. So types of detention basins, some of these are a little bit confusing, but we stayed, Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, we tried to stay consistent with the Harris County Flood Control District Policy Criteria and Procedure Manual to avoid confusion on the different types. So inline detention is just what it sounds like. That's detention within the channel or the stream. If it's a Harris County Flood Control District channel or identified channel, that's only allowed in certain circumstances, like at the upstream end of a watershed where all of the land draining to that upper end of the channel or stream is actually having detention provided for it. So in most cases, if it's a flood control channel, inline detention might not even be allowed. But depending, if it's not a flood control channel or if you're at the right spot of the watershed, it could be. So that's usually looks like widening out the stream or channel and then putting a restrictor, you know, maybe a smaller culvert than you would otherwise need at a crossing to get that detention volume in. Offline detention, so I've got the arrows here. What this reflects, and this basin could be within the development, it could be outside of a development, it could be right on the, you know, right near the road, somewhere else, but basically it's a side weir type basin. And what that means is that flows come out of the stream into the basin, usually through a side weir. It might be like a trapezoidal cut, it could be a sheet pile weir. It could even in some cases just be stacked culverts that are large enough to accommodate the 100-year flows coming in and out. And then ideally it's stepped down so that we also provide detention not only for the 100-year but also the 10-year and the 2-year. And then the terminology for this one is online detention, which is just basically a project, whether it's a road or a development, drains into a detention basin, which empties into the receiving system or stream. And so this criteria can apply to any of these types of facilities. I won't go through all the steps in the flow chart, but again, if you're, it's kind of a guidance of if you have a certain situation, then you might consider these types of multifunctional features. If you're interested in seeing more details on the criteria, just leave me your card and I'll get you a copy. But we're looking at things like water quality, detention versus retention. So, you know, what's the difference between detention or retention? If you work in water resources, you probably already know. But otherwise, think about it like a high school kid gets in trouble. Okay, well, they might get detention where they stay an hour or two after school's over. With a detention basin, we're holding back the flows and then releasing it within, you know, about 24 to 48 hours or so. Retention, they're in big trouble and they're gonna get locked up in the big house. So retention, our basin holds all of the water and we don't use it too much here, but it could infiltrate into the soils if you have well-drained soils, or it may provide a permanent pool. So you could have a combination of retention and detention. Okay, so typical modification. So this is a lot easier, I should say, starting from scratch on a new basin. It's a lot easier to incorporate everything, meet all your design and safety constraints. Basins can be retrofitted with this criteria, but there's just a lot more considerations because you have fixed items in place. So recreation, we see that pretty commonly with soccer fields or walking trails. Aesthetics may just be planted to provide aesthetics for the neighborhood. It could be trees around it, could be specific plantings within. The aesthetics, though, are going to tend to cover a couple of categories, because if it's trees around, that's also providing shade for a recreational walking path. Or if it's nice plantings, if they're done well, it may be providing some environmental benefits. Maybe you want to encourage certain species of birds or something. Okay, so single-use basin, basically a hole in the ground. We're familiar with it. It gets mowed, and that's about all it does. And it protects us in storm events from flooding. Recreational basin, so we might plop in a soccer field or some other feature in there, keeping in mind that obviously in a 100-year event, nobody's going to play soccer. Depending on the design, it could get a little bit soggy even in like a 2-year event or so that it's not necessarily functional 100% of the time. The first kind of exciting detention project I worked on was for Royal Oaks Country Club. It's been many years now, but it was really fun because the detention was provided within the golf course, as happens quite a bit with golf course developments. But we really got to look at not just the 100-year, but what happens in the 2-year, and the 1-year, and the 10-year. How playable is the course? Can we have enough depressed areas that stay wet but get everything else drained out really quickly? So we usually don't go to that level of detail on soccer fields, but you could. Okay, so some other things to think about is, does a local agreement need to happen? So a local agreement would typically happen if somebody else is getting involved for maintenance. So if the city of Houston is going to turn their CIP detention basin over to the flood control district for maintenance, but maybe it also has components that need to be maintained by the Parks Department because flood control is not going to maintain some irrigation that might be needed for a certain type of vegetation or the lighting or so forth. So that needs to really be looked at early on in the project so that doesn't hold things up at the end. ADA compliance might be necessary, or at least you may want a slope that's laid back and not at 3-to-1. You may want a 10-to-1 side or a 6-to-1 side to make it easier for people to access the basin. But we also need to look at safety. Does it need to be fenced? What are the ponding depths? That type of thing. So obviously flood control is really the driving factor here. It needs to function to provide flood control in the 100-year and greater events. Ideally you've got your freeboard in there so that you can accommodate maybe what used to be a 500-year event that's now a 100-year event. But also different tiered outfall structures to provide benefits during a 10-year event and even a 2-year event. Vector control, so that would be things like, what's the drain down time? If it's a 10-day drain down time, we're going to start to have issues with mosquitoes and other vectors. So, typically we would want to follow the Harris County Flood Control District policy and criteria manual regarding drain down time. Usually we're shooting for about 48 hours. Sometimes it might be 72. It really depends too on the tailwater and the receiving system. So if you're draining into Clear Creek in the undeveloped part of the watershed, where the stage and the stream stays pretty high and flat for a long time, your basin's not really going to be able to drain out until Clear Creek comes down, so to speak. So sometimes the drain down times are longer because of the receiving system, but that's really important to look at. And then when we look at what needs to be done differently with how the facility is maintained, all basins should have trash removed from them, but sometimes certain types of recreational facilities or vegetation might collect trash in a different way, where it's not as funneled to a trash rack or just a ring around the basin. I've seen some really pretty detention basins in the Kansas City area where they have really pretty native prairie grasses in them, but they will tend to collect trash in a different way. So you need to have somebody going in there and removing the trash from the basin. Things like fishing, you could do that in a wet bottom basin. Doesn't seem very healthy with the pollutants and the stormwater runoff to eat the fish, but you know, there's all types of different things that could be included in the recreation. Here's an example of a detention basin. So here we have a walking track. So that's a recreational feature. The trees probably provide some habitat for birds, depending on what trees they are. They may provide butterfly habitat too. They're also really important because they provide shade for the people walking along. So you know, you've got the kind of detention basin with park area. Aesthetic modifications, that might be as simple as taking that really straight pilot channel that's intended to quickly like drain flows out of the bottom of the basin and making it a little bit more winding. It might be coming in with bench sections where you're getting into a little bit more of like a natural channel or natural system design. And again, this is simpler to do when you actually design a basin from the beginning. Not that things can't be retrofitted, but it is a little bit more challenging to come back and do the retrofits. Here's a City of Houston case study at James Lee Park. Basically, there was flooding occurring during even a 2-year event within the park and the adjacent subdivision. And so Parks Department got on board with the city stormwater group, and they were able to come up with a collaborative solution where the park was also used for detention storage. And the local neighborhood was supportive of that use because they knew it was going to help with their flooding issues. This is a project that Water worked with the environmental group at the Harris County Flood Control District. And while it's not detention per se, it's basically, this location's along White Oak Bayou. But it's basically looking at the backslope swells, which traditionally are just a drainage feature. They take the overland sheet flow and capture it so that we don't just have flows, sheet flowing over the side of the channels or detention causing erosion. So they serve a really important function, but this is a retrofit to incorporate in vegetated swells and or bioretention and monitor how they perform in different soils within the county, see if that might help solve some erosion issues and also help the flood control district meet some of their MS4 water quality requirements. But I have this in here because a maintenance plan is very important for any of these systems that are either going to be retrofitted or designed from scratch and have something non-standard included in there. So this is just like an O&M fact sheet. This is a mixed-use development. This is an initial phase. It's about 1,000 acres plus in total. Everything that you see in turquoise, we identified and modeled as low-impact development, essentially like bioretention areas. So almost mini detention, if you will, really distributed throughout this neighborhood. There's some turquoise squares. Those are slightly larger, what we call hydro modification management facilities, and they're really designed to make sure that more storage is provided and we're not increasing flows in the smaller events, causing erosion to the receiving streams. But the really multi-use detention portion of this is there's an urban farm area that's been identified for overflows to provide some shallow storage in extreme events. Now off-site, there's also a centralized detention basin. And then I have this in here to remind me to talk about some other design issues that would be relevant for any detention basin. But this is a project where we're serving as expert witness, and the detention basin failed pretty spectacularly within about a year of being constructed. This one happens to have a retention portion, and it happens to be very, very deep. So there may be instances, whether it's a normal non-multi-use detention basin or whether it's a multi-use detention basin. If you start getting deep, you want to look at and make sure you're adhering with dam safety requirements that the TCEQ has. Sometimes you can meet certain criteria and they still won't classify it as needing to comply with dam safety. But so we want to look at really the big picture of are there other regulations that might come into play as we move forward. And then also the design is really important as you're changing up watersheds or integrating in additional features. It's not just making it pretty, we also need to make sure we have the civil and structural design components as well as erosion control that might be needed. This Parker Road was the City of Houston CIP project. So a while back, when I was at Dodson and Associates, I led the City of Houston Regional Detention Master Plan. It was kind of more sub-regional because it was we looked at all the watersheds in the city and we grouped CIP projects together. And we identified several projects that seemed reasonable to move forward with. One of them was a Halls Bayou sub-regional detention facility. And the idea is that these detention facilities would serve CIP projects, but not just serve one. We would try to serve multiple projects, maybe have excess capacity for developers, and have them be more multi-use, incorporating in things like water quality, low impact development, and so forth. So the Parker Road CIP project, we worked with LJA, they were the prime on that, and looked at what multi-use functions could go in there. It's adjacent to a park. We mentioned a park earlier. It's adjacent to Shady Lane Park. So there's an idea of, well, do we do something within the park? So that's always a thought. The park's pretty utilized, so we threw out LID within the park, and then it's like, well, it's right next to a flood control regional detention facility in Halls Bayou that's beautiful. Their wetlands plantings are gorgeous. It's really amazing. A lot of habitat, a lot of water quality benefits. So we said, let's do wetlands plantings in the park, tie it together, put a walking trail around it with tree planting for shade. And here's kind of a bird's eye view. This is the very large Halls Bayou Regional Detention Basin. And this is the smaller City of Houston sub-regional basin, which has room for expansion. That basically ties in, you don't see the plantings here yet, but it ties in and it has similar wetlands plantings. So that's an example of collaboration with the flood control district, and then they actually purchased the excess capacity in the basin. So it's really a win-win, and accepted it for maintenance. Okay, so that wraps up the City of Houston SWEPS or multi-use detention criteria.